Mr. Graf,
Will the sponsor yield?
will you yield, sir?
Yes.
Sponsor yields.
Yeah. Mr. Gottfried, on this bill here, I just want to clear up a couple things. Number one, you don't have to look any particular way. I don't have to be dressed as a female. I don't have to, all I have to do is say that, assert that I am a female. And I could use any woman's locker room, any woman's restroom, any woman's shower, correct?
Well, I don't think one can say what a court would conclude in what was essentially a fraudulent case.
Well, I'm not talking about that. What I'm talking about is...
And by the way, I know people who have two X chromosomes and are very adamant about being female, who many people to look at them are convinced that they're male. And I know one woman in particular who often there are women who in the women's room when they go into the women's room are very distressed.
Well, under this bill,
is there.
Well, hold on. Under this bill, he can look like a biker, right? He can sit there and, hop off his Harley Davidson, have his patch on the back for the Hells Angels, and if he says, I identify as a woman, and goes into the woman's restroom, right, and somebody tries to tell him to get out, right, or push him out of the bathroom, can they be charged with a crime here?
Well, I would hope that whoever it is would not be taking the law into their own hands and committing a criminal assault.
But can they be charged with a crime under this bill if they prohibited him from using that bathroom and pushed him out of the bathroom?
It is conceivable that you would have a factual dispute as to whether that biker was in fact acting in conformance with his gender identity or expression.
But under this bill, could the person be arrested from prohibiting him if he's claiming that, he's identifying as a female from using the shower, the locker room, or the bathroom? Could they prohibit him?
I think it would probably depend on the very specific facts of the case on both sides.
All right, let's try this.
But I am quite certain that these laws have been on the books in areas where, I don't know, 2/3, 3/4 of New Yorkers live for the last many years.
Well, that wasn't my question. My question
I understand that, but
is there a
part of
criminal
answering
component to this case?
Look, you asked me a question. I think I get to answer it in my
Well,
way.
you have to answer the thing is I asked you a specific question.
Well,
And the
I get
specific
to
question
answer it.
is there a criminal component to this case? Not about what other laws are in place. We're talking about this law. We're talking about this bill. Can a person under this bill be charged with a crime? Is there a criminal component to this bill?
biker?
Yes or no?
I think the biker you're talking about would be in great jeopardy of being accused at least of trespass and maybe other offenses, and I'd be very surprised if the biker you're describing got away with taking advantage of this legislation. And part of the proof of that is the length and breadth of the parts of the country that have been under this legislation where that has, I guess I should say, virtually never taken place. And maybe actually never taken place, because I think a lot of the examples we've heard don't come close to fitting within the circumstances of this legislation.
Well, how about if a police officer, somebody claims that, they identify as a woman, they go into a woman's locker room, they go in a woman's shower, and the police officer walks in there and says, and arrests a person, okay? What could happen to that police officer under this bill?
I think
Could he be charged with a crime?
It is very difficult to imagine circumstances in which he or she could, or charged with false arrest. Law enforcement officers have appropriately a fair amount of latitude to make reasonable judgments based on the circumstances they observe. The case you're describing strikes me as one in which a reasonable person looking at your biker example and conclude that this is not a person acting in conformance with his gender identity or expression.
Well, so, if the person's just dressed normally and says, I identify as a woman, but he's dressed as a man, that's acceptable under this bill, right? As long as he says, I identify as a woman, but he's dressed as a man, right? He's allowed to use the woman's locker room, woman's shower, woman's bathroom, correct?
There is no particular dress code that the bill would enact in order to qualify one to take advantage of the legislation.
Okay.
That is correct.
Okay. So now if a police officer walked in and the person says, I identify as a woman, he goes, well, and he arrests him, there's no repercussion on the police officer for arresting that individual? Is there any repercussion about him escorting him out of the bathroom? Are there any repercussions for that police officer under this legislation?
I don't think one can responsibly answer a question like that because it would be very highly dependent on all of the facts of the case as to whether that law enforcement officer was making a reasonable judgment.
Okay. Now, how about, is there any exemption here for people that are on the sex offender registry list?
I'm not quite sure how that would come into play.
All right. I got NBC News, right? And what we have is a person named Paul Ray Witherspoon, okay, that in Texas, that even though he was on the sex offender registry list from years earlier, he argued that, just because he was a sex offender, he still identified as a woman and could use the woman's bathroom and woman's shower, and nobody could stop him because the law, right, authorized him to do that. Do we have anything in this bill to prevent that from happening?
Well, first of all, tell us what the outcome of the case was, because if he was convicted, that might tell us something. And I don't know whether your NBC News report, whether you've carried your Google search far enough to find out the whole story.
All right.
Second, that does matter. Secondly, maybe my list of the states that have enacted gender legislation is out of date, and maybe my sense of the nature of politics in Texas is extraordinarily out of date, but I don't think this bill is the law in Texas.
All right. Well,
So wait a minute. So first of all, we don't know that he got away with it, whatever it was. Second of all, this legislation could not have come into play in the state of Texas unless I'm really missing something. So it sounds to me like your hypothetical or your example is not at all an example.
Right, well, I'll share this with you. The other thing...
By the way, am I right about that?
I've got to read the rest of it. How about this one? In Toronto, right?
Wait a minute. We haven't left Texas yet.
All right.
Let's finish Texas.
Well, in his case...
So the guy probably was convicted, and he would not have been able to take advantage of this legislation in any event because it wasn't the law in Texas. So the example from NBC News, apart from being utterly incomplete in terms of how much of the story it tells us, has nothing to do with this bill. But we can go on to the next example.
Well, and here's the other example, Toronto Sun, right? We have a sexual predator, all right, who basically claimed that he was transgender to get into female homeless shelters, and according to this, has attacked 4 vulnerable females between the ages of 5 and 53 in Montreal and Toronto over the past 12 years, that's the ones they know about. So this is another example where a person said that.
Well, sexual assault is illegal in this state, whether this bill becomes law or not, and whether you claim to be transgender or not.
Yes, but he was...
Sexual assault is illegal.
You're right, but he was able to access these vulnerable people by claiming that he was transgender
Well,
to get into a female shelter.
Well, I don't know about you, I don't know whether he got in by claiming to be transgender, but I do know that for millennia, men have been dressing up, claiming to be women, to get into places where they shouldn't be, long before anybody even heard of the word transgender or thought to enact a law like this. People get up in disguises and do all kinds of illegal things. And if we find them out, they're prosecuted and sent to jail. This bill doesn't change that.
Okay,
It
so
also doesn't give rise to it.
if I have a person who identifies as a woman, okay, they're a registered sex offender, right? And, they do live, as a female, as far as their clothing and everything. And I'm a police officer, and I've arrested this person before for the sexual abuse of a child. And the person goes into a female bathroom, a female locker room, or a female shower, all right? And I know that they're a sex offender, right? Can I walk in and take that person out? If they truly identify as a woman, but they're on a sex offender registry list, can I take them out of that locker room? Can I take them out of that shower? Can I take them out of that bathroom?
I think with this bill or without this bill, a law enforcement officer can take somebody into custody, to put it briefly, if there are reasonable grounds to believe that that person has committed a crime. And if such legal grounds do not exist, whether they're on a sex offender registry or not, whether they're transgender or not, whether this bill becomes law or not, unless you've got some kind of probable cause, in this country, a policeman is not supposed to take you into custody.
So the answer is no, he can't take them out of the shower, can't
Well,
get them out of the shower.
I don't want to
get
agree
them
to
out of the
your,
locker room or get them out of the bathroom.
I don't want to agree to your characterization of any of my remarks. My remarks stand as they are. If a law enforcement officer does not have reasonable cause to believe that someone has committed a crime, and I guess that's shorthand for a large volume of law, but basically put without that grounds, a law enforcement officer cannot take someone into custody. That's been the law in this country since our independence, and it was largely the law for a couple of hundred years before that. And I don't know anybody here in this chamber who would want to change that.
And again, if he did do that, a police officer did take that person out knowing he or she was a sex offender, all right, and they took him out of the bathroom, they could be subject under this bill to be arrested, correct?
Which they now?
The police officer. He could
Well,
be subject to
supposing-
arrest.
Supposing there is a gay man who has been convicted of a sex crime committed by that gay man upon another male. And that gay man goes into a men's room. And a police officer sees him there and says, "You once committed a sex crime against a man. Here you are in a men's room. I'm going to arrest you." I would hope that would not be the law in this country. And I don't know why it would be different here.
Thank you, Dick.
And,
On the bill.
maybe you disagree with me on that point. Feel free to say so.
On the bill.
But I don't think the law in this country disagrees with me.
On the bill, Mr. Graf.
We've been debating this bill for years, and I've talked to many people that I represent in my district, and overwhelmingly, they're opposed to this legislation. You know, we've tried to give some examples. We tried to give you some indication on what was going on here. And my constituents overwhelmingly want me to vote against this legislation, and I intend to do what my constituents have asked me to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.